Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, I'll just do a little intro. So thank you everyone for joining us today in our fourth session of the CEACR speaker series. First, we're just gonna help everyone choose their Zoom settings for the event. So I'll hand it off to our interpreter staff for instruction. We have both Spanish and ASL interpretation today.
Okay, thank you so much. We will activate the feature in just a few moments. So I'll go over these instructions in English and in Spanish. Buenas, bienvenidos, bienvenidas. Vamos a dar unas instrucciones sobre cómo seleccionar su idioma en Zoom y después activaremos esa opción para que puedan participar en español si gustan. So here in just a few moments, when the interpretation feature is activated, you'll be able to choose your language, and we ask that everyone select a language. Think of it as there's no default language. So this event is being carried out in English with Spanish interpretation. So we would like to ask that those of you that are participating
I believe Annabelle got added as an interpreter, so I'm gonna tip in right now to give you the instructions to select interpretation features. So again, you will find a globe icon in the middle of your screen in the bottom. If you are on a computer, you can click on the globe icon, and then you will find the option language interpretation. We ask you to please choose English. En Anabel la asignaron ya como intérprete, entonces les voy a dar las instrucciones de nuevo. En su pantalla, si están en una computadora, van a encontrar un icono de globo terráqueo al centro. Por favor, hagan clic, encontrarán la opción interpretación de idiomas, elijan su canal, en este caso español, y den listo para escuchar la interpretación. If you are on a Chromebook computer, you will not have access to this feature. Also, if you are on a tablet or phone, you need to tap your screen lightly and then find the three-dotted menu that says more. And then you will find the option, language interpretation. Please choose English as your language. Si está en una tableta o en un dispositivo móvil, haga clic en el menú de 3 puntos que está en su pantalla. También después haga clic en interpretación de idiomas, elige español y haga clic en listo. We remind you to speak at a slow pace and moderate pace so that we can all convey the information that is being said to everyone. Y les recordamos, si van a participar, que hablen a un ritmo natural, sin ir demasiado rápido ni muy despacio, para que puedan recibir toda la información, todas las personas. Thank you very much. We can continue now.
Thank you so much to all of our interpreters today and to our panelists. So again, welcome to the CEACR Speaker Series for November, Ethical Research with Community-Based Organizations. I'm Emily Finley. I'm from CCPH, Community Campus Partnerships for Health. We partner with University of Pittsburgh to support the SEAL Consultative Resource, or CEACR. And I'm going to hand it off now to our moderator, Ron Idoko, for a warm welcome and introduction to our panelists. Ron joins us from University of Pittsburgh, where he is Associate Director of the Center on Race and Social Problems. Thank you, Ron.
Thank you, Emily, and good afternoon, all. As noted, my name is Ron Idoko, and it's my pleasure to be with you all as we engage in this very important dialogue, working to really understand the importance of meaningful research ethics as organizations look to engage with community. I'm going to quickly review our panelists for today, including Rebecca Fielding Miller, Assistant Professor at the School of Public Health at UC San Diego, Jeanette Bowles, Doctor at British Columbia Center on Substance Use, Peter Davidson, Associate Professor at UC San Diego, Stephanie May, the Executive Director of the Bridge at Austin Community, Lekesha Benson, the Executive Director of the NOLA Network, and Elena Giacci, Anti-Sexual Violence Training Specialist. Welcome to our panelists and looking forward to engaging you in this dialogue. I'd like to start off with Rebecca, Jen, and Peter, if they can spend some time really talking about their research in terms of what they observed when it comes to establishing meaningful research ethics with community-based organizations. Rebecca, Jen, Peter, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I'm so glad that we all get to be here today. Maybe, Pete, if you don't mind, do you want to talk about the origins of this project and this paper, and then maybe Jen and I can talk about some of the things we learned?
Yeah, sure. Just to give a little background, I've been doing public health related and sociological research with people who use drugs, with people engaged in commercial sex work, and with other sort of stigmatized and hidden populations since about 1997. Originally in Australia, that's where the funny accent's from, and since 2000 here in the United States. And just about all the research that's conducted with sort of highly hidden and stigmatized populations tends to involve some sort of relationship with community-based organizations who are providing services to those groups. And I've also been involved on the community-based organization side as a board member who's often ends up reviewing applications by researchers who want to come and collaborate with us in some way. Over the years, I'd noticed that most of these collaborations worked very well, but every now and then something would go really badly wrong, and it would often go wrong in a way that ended up hurting the community-based organization rather than the researchers. So in 2015, we put in an application to the NIH to conduct an R21 two-year study of ethical issues that emerge between community-based organizations and researchers when they try and collaborate. And I ended up partnering with Dr. Fielding Miller to actually do that work. We went and did a series of qualitative interviews with people working at community-based organizations who'd had some sort of collaboration with researchers to find out what their experiences had been and where things had broken down and what lessons we could learn about how to actually do this correctly. Rebecca, do you want to sort of talk about the findings?
Yeah, so I ended up doing a lot of the interviews. I had just finished my PhD and moved out to San Diego, and a lot of my previous work had been in global health. I do a lot of work in Southern Africa. And as I started doing these interviews, and this is the part where I always have to mention that I went to Cleveland in February and Pete went to New Orleans, which just still feels a little unfair, but it's fine.
Yeah, privilege.
But I was really struck by how a lot of the conversations that we were having really mirrored a lot of what I had seen working with folks in South Africa in what's now known as Eswatini, used to be known as Swaziland, and how really consistent a lot of these topics were. And the other thing that happened as I had these conversations is I had to have a real reckoning with myself and the way that I had been working. And I think I have always tried to be a decent person and a decent partner. But there is so much that had never occurred to me. And so the process of doing these interviews was so eye-opening. It became even more important that we get a lot of this information out. So for example, the one really big theme that came out was just this hidden burden that research can place on academic on community-based organizations. So a researcher comes and they think they're just asking to put up a poster, and I can see the people smiling who have been on the other side of this. So they think they're just asking to put up a poster, but who's going to answer questions about the poster? Who's going to vouch for the organization? Who's going to explain what that actually means and what that IRB stamp is actually about? Even just a poster is a lot of work. Or there will be mission creep, where somebody will say, well, let's just do, I just want to reach out to people and understand, I don't know, how people get access to healthcare. But then it doesn't just become healthcare, it also becomes violence, and it also becomes, you know, tell me about your childhood experiences. And all of these things that the organization did not sign up to vouch for, this burden that they don't want put on the community is suddenly being put there. And so I think Pete had seen a lot of pretty catastrophic experiences, but a lot of what came out was also just like the day-to-day disrespect, and not even purposeful disrespect, but just the lack of seeing what you are asking for. And what we started to think about was how that really came from a place where researchers were in this framework of, I am following the rules of traditional ethics. I have asked people to sign this sheet for informed consent, and it's fine. I have respected their autonomy, and it's fine. But they weren't thinking about what it means to be in a respectful, mutual relationship with somebody, where there is give and take, where there is respect for the community's expertise, and where there is the amount of humility to say, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that, I'm sorry, let me try and do better. And so when we went to publish this paper, which by the way, it took about 8 submissions. I've never had more trouble publishing a paper than this one, except for all my COVID ones, which are also a nightmare, but this is also hard. We talked about how there is this kind of very traditional, very like Western biomedical way of ethics where you're following the rules and it's fine. But there's this other way of thinking about engaging ethically, and it comes out of sort of feminist thinking that's about the relationships that you're building and the care that you're putting into the work. And so certainly the thing I learned was the importance of being in relationship, respectful relationship with people, where you are mindful of the burden and where you are mindful of who is getting the benefit. This is work. I get professional benefit from this work, right? I get promoted, I get paid, I get to put in a grant. And who is facing the burden and not really seeing a lot of professional benefit unless it is thoughtfully baked in. That's mostly what struck me, and a lot of what has kind of changed my practice over time. Jen, I'm curious what you thought of through this process.
Thank you both. So I came into this project after data had been collected and the idea had been, like already brought into fruition. And while working in graduate school, I was also a co-director of a community-based organization that works with women and queer folks involved in the sex trade and who use drugs. And so the topic was really interesting to me because I had been the recipient of many emails from researchers who had already received their grants, had already gone through REB, who had never engaged us and just wanted to use our organization to recruit participants and acted like they were doing us a favor. And in doing so, right? It was like, hey, like, we're going to give folks a gift card, right? They never asked us about what an appropriate incentive would be. And I don't want to take away from, we have directors here of community-based organizations who I think it's really important to highlight the work that you all are doing now. This is years ago about what got me really interested in this topic. But there was a lot of entitlement that I felt was coming from folks in research. And this was just anecdotally what I was experiencing. So when Becca and Pete and I were able to collaborate on this project, and I was reading the transcripts and finding so much of my own experience was occurring throughout the US among organizations that were doing similar work, it was heartening to realize that I wasn't alone, but it was also frustrating because now, as somebody who works in research, you know, ensuring that we show up with the lessons learned, but still seeing colleagues who perpetuate these, I don't know, like really just like entitled to space approaches. And so going back to this paper, the Belmont report is something that we kind of learn in graduate school is like our holy grail of ethics. This was developed to ensure that folks who are research participants in our studies are protected because researchers, you know, can get we can get like cloudy-eyed, especially in biomedical research about like wanting to experiment on people. And, you know, the lines of informed consent versus coercion, and ensuring that folks are, you know, treated respectfully within the research process. So all of that to say, as research has kind of shifted in ways where researchers are partnering with community-based organizations more and more, where does IRB come in when it comes to like what our relationships look like with community-based organizations as this intermediary between us as researchers and participants, and then even sometimes community-based organizations being the topic that you're talking about. I've also had, and this came up in our research too, that there were directors who were nervous about the research that was being done because it was like, you know, we're working so hard, we're underfunded. What happens if this reflects poorly on our research? Do we trust that the researcher will frame this in a way that doesn't say this organization is not successful in doing their work, but this is the support that they need to better do their work? So there were a lot of themes that were really, I think, spoke to my own experiences. And, you know, Pete and Becca had mentioned that as well. And so this was research that felt, you know, important for a variety of reasons, and ensuring that research grows in a way that maintains the ethics of, I don't want to say protecting like vulnerable participants, because I know that's an important part of the Belmont report. The word vulnerability I struggle with, considering how strong and tough people who are surviving horrific conditions are. But nonetheless, there's structural vulnerabilities that people are dealing with on a daily basis that I feel researchers lose sight of pretty frequently. And I hope that our research spoke to that a bit. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Peter, Rebecca, Jen, greatly appreciate your insights and the work that you've done to highlight what certainly sounds like a systemic problem, right? That this isn't located in any one part of the country, that this is something that we can probably see around the country. And I'd like for us to learn more about the actual impact on the community-based organizations in this space. And we have 3 leaders in that space that I'd like to hear from, again, reflecting on some of what has been shared by the researchers. And so I'd like to turn first to Stephanie. If you can talk about your experiences in terms of, you know, engaging with researchers and the sorts of practices you've seen that may have had an impact on your community, perhaps one that is not intended.
Yes, my name is Stephanie May, and I'm hoping that everyone can hear me. I am here in Metro Atlanta, in a city that you probably are not familiar with, Conyers, Georgia. And I am the executive director for an organization called the Bridge at Austin Community Center. And when I accepted the position as executive director, I had 32 years of experience as a teacher in the public schools in Metro Atlanta and as a principal. What drew me to this organization, however, was its ability to reach beyond the 4 walls and to bridge the gap between the organization and the community. And so some of the things that I have seen, particularly recently, have to do with the mistrust between the community and either academia or the health and science, health and wellness community. For example, vaccine hesitancy. One of the services that we provide is that, we offer the vaccination for the community, and we provide incentives for the community when they want to come in and have the vaccination. But the questions that they have and the insecurity and the mistrust that they have, it did not start with us. So there's a history, there's this almost 100-year history of their perception of the way that our community is valued by the scientific community, that we're objects. And so I'll get more into that as we, continue. But it has been my experience that trust building and bridge building are more important than anything else that I do as a liaison between academia and our community here in Metro Atlanta.
Thank you, Stephanie. Appreciate your thoughts. I'd like to turn to Lekesha to offer reflections on this space as well, with regards to your experience engaging with research institutions.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Okay. I started taking notes when Jen was talking, because she really hit on something that I have some experience with and found. And one of the things, and I have the unique experience of not only am I the executive director of NOLA, but I'm also an elected official. And so we have at times had to also work with some academic, some universities near that are doing research and trying to delve into the community and do some work. And one of the most frustrating things for me is that oftentimes the academic sector and the people that acquire the funding and they're doing the research, they want to come in and they want to help, but they acquire the funding and they're conducting the research, but they don't often understand the population that they're trying to provide the services and do the work with. And that can be really frustrating. One of the things that I find with working with the community is when there is an issue, I think 9 times out of 10, that community understands their issue and they probably know the solution to the issue. What they don't have is the access to the services or the resources to correct the problem. And I think that sometimes, and I love working with other organizations, but it can be frustrating when the funding is going to the people, then they come in and they already have a preconceived notion as to this is what we think will correct your problem without asking the community, hey, what is the problem? And if you come in with your ideas of a solution, usually there's just a disconnect. You can provide me with all the help you think I need. You can give me 1,000 things, and it might not be the one thing that I know I actually needed. And that is what I have that's what I have observed. And it can be really frustrating. I don't know if other people have had that experience, but that's definitely been my experience.
Appreciate you sharing that, Lekesha, and certainly to your point, communities often know what they need most, and more times than not, it's the lack of resources that impact their ability to achieve, meaningful sort of success or navigation of those challenges. I'd like to turn to Elena for you to share your experience with regards to past experiences with research organizations and what you've taken notice of.
Well, first, I would absolutely agree with both Stephanie and Lekesha about how people enter into communities. And with our Native community, I mean, we have such a terrible history with researchers and the abuse of our communities, whether it be the old time, barrel alcohol study or the Havasu tribe in Arizona. All of those components really have continued to add to the mistrust of anybody coming into our community, much less all of the historical trauma that we've endured and still endure of the racism, oppression, and the trauma. And so add all of that into someone who comes in And like both Lekesha and Stephanie were talking about, is have no clue to how to operate within our community. Don't really go about it in a good way. Don't do a lot of groundwork of getting to know us. We often will not even hear from people until they've already gotten the grant, like was said earlier, and then they're like, this is what we're going to do. And lucky you, we're going to research you. And it's like, and who gave you permission? And what's going on? And there's this wide protection wall that pretty much goes up immediately, and rightfully so, about not trusting what is about to happen. And it goes from the very beginning. Like they said, posters go up and they're, you know, culturally inappropriate or don't have anything or are not well received because there isn't any information. The gift card is just something else to experience when you're there, because they'll go, oh, we can give a Walmart card, and the closest Walmart is 400 miles away. So when you start looking at those kind of pieces, and I find it really interesting that everybody thinks that Native people love Walmart, and you know that I love Walmart, but the idea is that having no experience on what is necessary or what that community and the individuals in that community really want. And part of it is the lack of transparency, the lack of making an investment in the community prior to doing anything, laying the groundwork. And I had the privilege to work with Dr. Miller, and we had done a lot of things together, and that laid the groundwork for experience with people working with both Dr. Miller and myself. And it was critically important because I'm not a researcher. I am not a researchy person. And so that is a whole different language and a whole different way to operate. And it was like we were talking about two different languages when she would talk to me, and then I would talk to her. And then somewhere in that between, we had to learn each other's language. But that was just laying the groundwork and being honorable and being transparent and walking in a good path. And oftentimes we're expected to take care of that path 5 miles ahead of us when we haven't been well informed and not included in the first part. So I think that's one of the most critical pieces that I think I heard from all three of us, is the lack of real respect and honor walking into our community.
Elena, greatly appreciate you fleshing that out further for us to consider. And certainly that theme has held true across all of your reflections, how that lack of transparency, the lack of groundwork, the lack of relationship building can really impinge upon and in many ways impact the sort of experience that people have with these partnerships. I'd like to turn back to Peter, Rebecca, and Jen. One of the things that you noted in your paper was how the lack of these ethics being in place can actually work to position institutions to uphold intersecting systems of oppression across race, gender, and class. If you could, can you talk more about that in terms of how does that work, or where do you see the sorts of systemic impacts with regards to oppression because of the lack of ethics, right? How might institutions might be unknowingly perpetuating the same sorts of issues that they might be trying to address in the research?
Go ahead, Pete.
No, I was going to say, I think you're better equipped to address that one. Go for it.
Yeah, that's a big question. So I think this is also one of the places where I have certainly noticed a lot of overlap in work that's done in the US and work that's done outside of the US. And you know, I was recently at a conference where some folks were kind of pointing out that we use this acronym LMIC for low and middle income countries, and maybe it should be low and middle income contexts instead, to draw attention to the way that we work in the global South is not that different from the way that we work, you know, the difference between Decatur and Conyers, for example, and Atlanta. You know, I think a lot of people who want to, myself included, who want to do this community-based work are coming from a good place, have good intentions. And a lot of folks who are doing this work are doing it because they want to address issues of health disparities, issues of a lack of access, and do have a basic working knowledge that the problem is structural. The problem is not that people chose to live in substandard housing, the problem is redlining, right? There is a basic understanding of this. But the issue that comes up is when you think about how the fact that the ends don't justify the means, that the way you go about this work has to be done in a way that is also dismantling these systems that are causing the problem in the first place. If you do the work of research in a way that reinforces the systems of oppression that caused the health disparity in the first place, then you're not actually addressing the problem, you're reinforcing the problem. So for example, one of the things that we noticed as a pattern is there are these very gendered and raced patterns, right? Community-based work is care work, is gendered as female, even if, like, we talk to men and women who are directors, but like a lot of women work in community-based organizations, right? And like obviously the three folks we have with us are three women of color, and a lot of faculty, even though you know, me and Jen are here representing for the ladies, but like there is this sort of image of the academic as like the white male, right? And so even if the individual people who are interacting don't necessarily fall into those categories, you have a sort of a social position that is kind of coded as male and white, interacting with a social position that is coded as often female, often a woman of color. And you can't pretend like those things don't exist when you're doing this work. Just because you have a PhD doesn't mean you get to leave your identity at the door and you're suddenly operating outside of these systems. It often means that you really benefited from those systems, right? Like both of my parents have graduate degrees. There's a reason I'm sitting here. And I think that there is a desire to pretend as if science is objective, evidence descends from the sky, and we can use the passive voice in everything that we're writing because facts just exist. But when we erase the identity of who is doing the work, then we erase the need to also incorporate praxis into the way that we do the work. We have to think about who has power. We have to think about who has power in a conversation, in a budget, in a dissemination process. And that, I think, is the piece that often gets left behind, because when you are throwing a grant together in a mad rush, there's no section for praxis that the study section cares about, right? There's a dissemination section and nobody actually reads it or cares about it. You're soft money and you just have to fund your salary, and like, I promise I'll do better when I have tenure, but you know. And so it's hard. It's a really, really hard way to work. But I think it's important. I don't know that you can be successful forever doing it. Like, ask me in 10 years if you can work this way and like still be soft money. I don't know. But I think if you want to address health disparities, it's the way you have to go.
I do want to add something about well-meaning researchers and unintended consequences. And, you know, I don't think we met anyone in this research that we conducted who was, you know, viciously trying to do something negative in the community. Everyone, even situations that ended really poorly, you know, everyone had come in with best intentions. And I think one of the kinds of things that many of us run into is even in describing a problem that exists in a community, you can do a kind of harm. And the best example of that I have is from my own work with people who use drugs, because, you know, if I'm going to do a study on hepatitis C transmission. The easiest way to get 300 people to follow in a cohort is to go to one of the poorest parts of town and hand out $10 bills to people to get tested. And in the course of that research, I end up discovering people's lives have all sorts of terrible problems, and I write all these well-meaning papers talking about all the terrible problems that people are facing. But what I end up doing in that process is essentially describing drug use as this thing that leads you to end up homeless on the street and absolutely destroyed. And that's not what drug use in the United States looks like universally. But I've ended up reinforcing this stereotype that says if you use drugs, these terrible things will happen, and so on. And so I'm ending up making things worse for communities of people who use substances, through the best of intentions and through attempting to address the things that I'm seeing right in front of me. And I know lots of communities, I know there's a lot of, historic research, particularly with Native American communities, that has had that effect, where by describing problems, that's made it seem like all Native American populations are complete disasters. And that's hugely problematic.
Indeed, appreciate the reflections. And certainly it sounds like for all researchers, there has to be significant consideration of the historical and social context in which they are engaging this research, if only not to perpetuate, as you noted, stereotypes or misrepresentations of challenges that communities are facing. I'd like to invite everyone on the panel to really think about this next question. Because the study talked about principles beyond respect and benefits and justice to consider more concepts like relationships, care, and solidarity. And so I'd like for us to think more about what does that actually look like in practice? And then what other principles might you want to see included as part of that sort of ethical baseline? And so I'd like to open up the floor to folks to share thoughts on that.
So this is Dr. Stephanie May again. And as the executive director for the Bridge, I invited some of the members of the Bridge to attend this session. It is so important that you give the community a voice. And so when I looked at the questions, I actually posed the questions to some of the members of the Bridge. And I came up with a pretty concise statement here that says, in practice, you have to do what you say you are going to do. Partner with people in the community that you've built relationships with. If I do not trust you, I will not share my story with you. So here are some principles. What about empathy, transparency, selflessness? Those have to outweigh the concepts of greed. And we talked a lot this week about greed and how it is the motivating factor for what large corporations and large universities, they're based on the ability to bring in those research dollars, that greed, but how much of it actually makes its way into the community. So we want those things, the empathy, the transparency, and the selflessness to outweigh greed, insincerity, and the social disconnection. In other words, it's okay for me to come and get the information, but you're not invited to share in the bounty and the blessings that come along with the information. Once you have the information, and maybe, yes, we do get a $5 gift card or something at Walmart or whatever, but do we ever really share in the benefit of what you have learned and processed and gleaned and the papers that you've written? That's why I appreciate this panel, and that's why I invited members of the community to share, because they need to know why we are always reaching out to the research community and to the academic community to help us with the boots on the ground problem solving that we do on a day-to-day basis. So those would be the things that I think should be added, again, to reemphasize empathy, transparency, and selflessness. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. And thank you for being intentional about engaging your community, right, to really understand what they want to see as far as this experience, and really emphasizing the importance of that researchers shouldn't just do the research and dip out, that folks want to know what the outcomes are and what the plan is to actually work to address some of those challenges. I'd like to invite others to also chime in on this question. What else do we think we need to see to really ensure meaningful research ethic relationships?
Well, I'll add my 2 cents. I think at the very beginning, and I appreciate the idea of we're not being intentionally, coming into a place where we're trying to do harm or be bad or be a bad actor in it. That being said, when someone comes into our community without a clue and doesn't understand what that nation, tribe, pueblo, village is even about, that seems very thoughtful in not thinking, is that we're going forward, we're going into a community, and we have absolutely no education about what the protocol is, how to act, what we're really asking of these people, why they might not trust us at all. And so for me, prior to you even coming into our community, you should at least allow yourself to be trained by members of that community or people that are familiar with that community before you even step in there and say, trust me, here I am, aren't you lucky? When there is so much mistrust. And if you don't get that from the day that you step onto our nations and reserves and villages, then there's already because you have already shown us great disrespect by not even knowing who we are and by not going to some of our social events, our powwows, our health education fairs. And we give thousands of health education fairs. And so there's no reason why you couldn't have a table and talk to people and do all sorts of different things. But if you're not educating yourself about the community and you go into that community, that's purposeful because you're not doing something to honor that community right off the top. And then, as always, I can completely agree about what Stephanie was saying in the fact that when we're not being transparent, you're not telling us all about it, you're not including us in the amount of money that you're getting. I remember that somebody wanted almost all the time, they go, okay, you can educate us. And it's like, and for how much money are you going to pay us? And they hold up a $20 gift card. And then you're saying, so I imagine you're doing all of this research and doing all of this for the $20 gift card too, right? Because that's one of my grandmas said to the lady with the, the rental car coming in and saying, okay, so is that what you get paid too? And then it's fair. But if that's not what's happening and you don't honor the people that are educating you first off, then that's not showing any respect what they hold as education, what they hold as wisdom, and you're not honoring that. And establishing the relationships, of course, but also understanding the political climate, our political climate. And just imagine if we had to go through what the country just went through, and in some places we do it every 6 months, every year, and the whole system changes, and then going back. So really understanding timetables, political ideas, establishing roles, understanding the who, what, and where, and how you can make and leave that community better. So if you're doing research on a bunch of computers, leave those computers there, leave them for the community, doing those types of important components that say, I honor you and I am actually going to spend time, and not fulfill the, okay, well, we're going to do alcohol and drugs because we know you all have problems with that. And instead understanding the racism, the oppression, the historical trauma, the lack of employment, the lack of food, the lack of being, all of these components putting together before you walk on my land. Yeah, that's what you need to do.
Appreciate that breakdown, Elena. Absolutely. Lekesha.
I was going to piggyback off of something that she just said, but I also wanted to note that we keep bringing up the gift cards, and I'm just laughing out loud in my office because I always find that so annoying. And I know that research says, right, that incentives get people to participate, but I always found it, I don't know, presumptuous of you to think that a $20 gift card is worth my time. And so when I've worked with clients and people, I've worked in nonprofits for over 20 years, and I frequently find myself identifying more so with the clients and being insulted for them. So again, every time we bring up the gift card, I thought, can we think of a better incentive? And of course, gift cards are, sometimes that's great, and sometimes it's just insulting. And so I guess understanding, again, it's back to the understanding the population that you're trying to serve and their needs. Why don't we ask people, what is it that would benefit you? How can we compensate you for your time? Because they are needed, their opinions are needed for us to even do the research. But, and I forgot what I was gonna say before that, because I'm just so annoyed by the gift card concept. But, and again, it's not bad in and of itself, but it can be at times frustrating. What Elena just said that really also struck me that I wanted to piggyback off of is the compensation, right? We're coming in and we're saying, hey, we need a family to come in. I'm just giving an example of something I've seen in my community. And there was some research being conducted about families and poverty. And so we'll give you a $20 gift card and buy your family pizza for you to come spend 6 weeks with us of your night. But the people conducting the classes are getting like $4,000 a session. I mean, you know, you're making more on your part-time job than I'm making my full-time job to do this research. And then what happens after you do it? And that's and that is further frustrating, because a lot of times you come into a community, and again, this is not me knocking it, this is just some of the negative observations I've had. You come into the community and you conduct research and you get your findings, and then you leave. And then you didn't really leave the community better than you found it. And then there's no, there's nothing after. So when she said, you know, leave the resources, leave the computers or whatever it is you did, but leave the community better than you found it. But to be authentic in what you want, what your desires are, I think that would be helpful, because there's not a lot of oftentimes authenticity. And again, I don't think anybody comes into it to harm anybody. I think that everybody, and that was said, that I think everybody comes into it with a desire to help. But what is your motive for helping? Is it just to write a paper? And that's okay. That is okay. But is that your desire? I'm a firm believer that community research should be, even though I know we need academia to come in and do it, I think that most of the time it should be community-led, and that the academic side should come walk alongside them to conduct the research. But I believe that if you want true change in the community, it needs to be community-led, because when the researchers remove themselves in the community, those members are still there. And so if nothing moved, if the needle didn't move, Elena or myself or Stephanie or whomever is in the community that had partnered with the researchers, we're still there, and we still have to answer the questions, and we're held accountable for what promises were not kept or made, or whether the needle moved forward or backward. So I think that was all I was going to say, but let's think deeper than gift cards. And I do want to say this too, people don't always need an incentive. Sometimes it's incentive enough that someone actually asked you what you thought or cared, and then you see the work being done. That is oftentimes incentive enough. Okay, that's all.
Indeed, really greatly appreciate the thoughts, and to the extent that, you know, these are really meaningful practices and principles for research organizations to consider. You know, I'd like to hear from Peter, Rebecca, Jen, your thoughts on what research institutions, academic institutions? What do they need to do? What sort of changes do we need to see in those environments to be much more aware of these community level research ethics? What sort of practice shifts, what sort of cultural shifts do you think need to happen?
I have two thoughts on that. First, I really agree with what Lekesha said. And I think personally, the research that I've done through my career that I've been most proud of has been research where the research question and the study only happened 2 or 3 or 4 years after I'd been volunteering with or working with that community. And it emerged that this is a question that the community had that needed answering, and I could take the skills I have and apply it to that question. So the question was coming out of the community, and it was already clear at the beginning of the project what needed to be done with the answers to that research, like how it could actually do something of positive benefit to the community. Whereas the research that I'm the least proud of is stuff where I airdropped into a community, was there briefly, did a quick thing, and then left without ever really getting to engage with that community and learning what they really need. To sort of get to Ron's question a little bit more, I think one of the things that came out of the research project Rebecca and Jen and I did was one of the best protections community-based organizations have when they're interacting with researchers is a written memorandum of understanding with the researchers up front that says everything from who's going to do what bits, who owns the data, who's going to be listed as authors on papers that come out of it, how is the outcomes of the research can be delivered back to the community, all of that stuff just written down. And I think from a university structural point of view, one of the things we kind of came to is maybe anytime a researcher does something with a community-based organization, they have to write an MOU, and the MOU has to be part of their IRB process. Not necessarily because an IRB or ethics board will spot some glaring problem, but because it forces the researchers to think, oh, someone else is going to look at this relationship that I'm proposing to start. And I really need to think about, am I actually doing this the right way? It won't solve every problem, obviously, but it was one of the things that we came to out of this work.
Yeah, I remember there was one person I talked to who had an issue with a researcher, and they got on the university website and found the phone number for the person's department chair. Did you talk to them, or did I? I can't even remember. It was so long ago. Was that you?
I think that was me. And
that was you. They all are all in my head. But they found the department chair. I think they found the IRB too. And they called somebody's chair, and they were like, you need to know what's going on. And it is amazing to me how little adult supervision I often have when I'm out running around in a community. And I don't know that IRBs are always perfect. I once had an IRB tell me to replace, this was in Tanzania, tell me to replace the WhatsApp number of the local PI and put the phone number, no, the email address of the UCSD IRB on there instead. And we were working with, this was with sex workers in rural Tanzania. And I was like, what are you going to do with an email in Swahili if you even get an email? Anyway, I don't know that IRBs are perfect, but I do think that researchers need to be responsible to somebody. The flip side of that is, so I'm working on a COVID project now, and there are these, sometimes there are pushes, these structural pressures from institutions that maybe just alleviating them would also be helpful. For example, this COVID project, there are these CDEs, these common data elements that everybody who got this pot of money has to ask. And they're pretty intrusive questions, especially when you're working with kids. So what sex was your child assigned at birth? Does your child smoke? Does your child drink? Is your child pregnant? Is your child LGBTQ? And we're working, imagine being asked to answer those questions about your 6-year-old when what the question is about COVID. And we had an entire school district take a look at those questions and say, I'm not going to deal with parents at a school board if you start asking people these questions. And an entire school district declined to work with us. And I thought that that was a really fair choice, actually. I was not going to advocate that they put these questions on there that our funder had said we had to ask, that I thought were not correct. And I think because I backed off so quickly, we still have that relationship and we're working together on other projects, but there are structural pressures that can be really hard to navigate as an academic. And I think that a willingness to push back against them and see how much you can get away with is scary but important.
I think another structural place is actually dealing with funders of research. Like, you know, I often review grants for the NIH, and if I see someone proposing research that is going to go in and do stuff in the community, if I don't see a whole bunch of letters of support from the community saying, we love and trust this person and we really want to work with them on this project, then I tend to score that grant really poorly. But, you know, that's just me. Other people are just looking at the science and signing off on the whole thing. And you guys suddenly have someone here dropping in saying, I've already been funded and I want to do this. Like several of you have already brought this up. And I think the funders have a role in stopping this kind of nonsense as well.
I'm going to return also to the gift card thing, because I think it's really symbolic of a lot of what we've been talking about. And that I think there's a big responsibility on researchers to advocate within their own institutions for change. And I mean that by way of, I've been approached by researchers who wanted to work or who wanted to, use our organization to do recruitment. But they were saying IRB will only approve distributing gift cards, and our community action board or community advisory board said, like, just kind of has like a decree that like we want to be paid in cash for our time because gift cards aren't as valuable to us as cash is. And so I remember being approached by a researcher from an Ivy League institution who was just like, look, this is unchangeable. Like IRB has said gift cards, like cash isn't allowed. And it was like, okay, then we can't say yes to partnering with you because our community advisory board has this, as a really meaningful part of engagement. And so it put the pressure then back on the researcher to argue with their own institution about why cash was the most ethical approach, right? And that any pushback that they were receiving, not to just receive that at face value, but to engage in conversation and do their own research within what the ethics documents are for the institution, to find a way to say, this is how we honor community needs and community asks, and show up respectfully, is not by saying, here's what we're going to give you, but we're going to honor, like what it is that's being asked of us. And that can happen from so many different places, whether it's the institution or, like Pete said, whether it's the funder. There's a lot of places, and those fights might not always be won. But if there's enough pressure over time, it can ideally result in some change. And not just backing down, I think, is really important. Part of my own education, in community health was like what's been said earlier, that the community is expert, that we're not supposed to show up, like as the expert. And it's, ensuring that we practice what we preach. And I see the opposite of that happening so frequently. And I'd really like to see more of the further that I went in my education and the longer that I stay in this field, the more I realize I don't know. And I think the power in recognizing that has been really beneficial overall. Thanks.
Appreciate you sharing. And certainly, I think the idea of folks becoming much more aware of where their gaps are, where they might be better served at working to understand how their own practices might not be most effective, and being okay with saying, like, just because we've done something for so long a certain way doesn't mean we have to keep doing it that way, especially if it's not meeting the needs of the communities we are trying to serve. I want to invite members of the audience to share questions. And so feel free to share your questions in the chat or to raise your hand if you'd like to share a question openly. We want to ensure that, again, we're being inclusive in surfacing any sorts of thoughts or questions folks might have. Sharon, I see that you have a question.
Hi, everyone, and thank you to the presenters that shared. My colleague Sudha Srinivas and I are on this call listening intently. We've been doing community engaged research for, 20 years, Sudha, together. And we see a lot of what you are talking about. And we have worked with indigenous groups who have no written language. And so we have crossed, and I'm looking at us as we are graying, thinking, my goodness, where was this conversation when we started out? But one of the things that I want to talk about is we work primarily with immigrants and refugees, and we have a Center for New North Carolinians, which is the only center on campus that's more service provide. And we're at an R2, so we don't have deep pockets. We cobble together. And a couple strategies that we've used, because we do it, we are the boots on the ground. We can't employ program coordinators or what have you. So as PIs, we have to sit at the table and be there from cradle to grave, morning, noon, and night. And one of the things, there are two strategies we've employed. One is we work with the next generation who are cultural insiders. And a lot of times, because you're at big institutions, you forget these institutions do have individuals from the communities in front of you. They're not just your students, they're your cultural insiders. And that we have cobbled together everything from, I don't know, what is it? Honors thesis to dissertations to independent studies to all kinds of things, internships and so service learning, engaging these cultural insiders with our other researchers and ourselves to kind of help us frame things. We also have them broker the conversations with their elders and individuals as they do as the next generation. So we've found that very useful. And when you have very little to work with, you get very creative. The second is a document. As research fellows, we came up with, a collective of us came up with, on how do you want, when you go in to work with refugee and immigrants, highly vulnerable, folks that are undocumented and limited English profession, how do you do this? So one thing we did as a collective was draft a document. I'm happy to drop it in the chat so that anybody wanting to come in and understand, it's our collective experiences and what we've learned from the community. And this is open to the community also to edit. Third and final things, we all live in, if you're an academic, then you want to keep your job. So it's publish or perish and all this wonderful stuff. One of the things we've decided to do to honor our communities also to begin to look at open access mechanisms. The whole journal production is very colonialistic and oppressive, and the tier one and the impact factor. And the one thing that it's a firewall. So our community can't even get the information to then apply for their grants that we've reaped and built our CVs on. So one of the things we've talked about and are working with our library is this, what are, credible open access venues? And they're not all cheap. So let's kind of go through and see. And then finally, we have a promotion and tenure scenario in which we actually have a track for applied or the scholarship of application. And with time, we will in PNT be able to probably invite in community members in which this person's dossier reflects working with them. So it's not really questions, it's just comments or suggestions from another perspective from institutions that we don't have medical schools, we're primarily undergraduate, but we're highly engaged researchers. These are some of the things. So I'll stop there, but thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Sharon, for taking the time to further inform us and to provide resources. Certainly as a community, we can learn from each other, and certainly the practices you've outlined are very impactful. We look forward to learning more about your work. I see in the chat here from Arlene, concerns sometimes researchers may make misassumptions, educational levels of minorities and people with low income levels. So being mindful of not assuming sort of the characteristics of the communities you're engaging based on service level characteristics. Yes.
Oh, I just wanted to add on to what Dr. Morrison was saying about journals and sharing back information and sort of what venues are prioritized. I would love to see someday a system of journal ranking that's done by how accessible those journals are. Are they open access? Do they have a lot of authors from the global South, from rural areas, from institutions that primarily serve historically marginalized communities? I know that in talking with colleagues, both in Eswatini and in San Diego, there is such a specific way of writing and reading to these articles, and it's a huge barrier. I've talked to a lot of people who are brilliant and who say, I don't want to spend the time writing that so it can sit around for 8 months and I can deal with 3 people who don't know what they're talking about. And it's a huge barrier to getting expertise out in the world. And I think it would be lovely if there was more prioritizing of roundtables like this, of oral presentations, of other way of disseminating information that also counted for, credit for people like us, but that were valued in the same way that a high impact journal article would be. That would be lovely.
Indeed. And I'm still processing in my head the idea that folks go into communities to research them and then try to put them in a position where they have to pay to find out what they learned, right? That's a hard one to swallow. With the limited time that we have left, I want to invite all of our panelists, if you want to take about 30 seconds to provide some closing thoughts. Want to ensure that we hear you in terms of things that you folks to take away as we look to close out this space. And I'm just going to go down the list. And so I'll start with Stephanie.
Yes. So Arlene Winfrey was the last person who put well, there's another person from the bridge. So we have 2 comments from the bridge, but I will address Arlene's. Please don't make assumptions when you come into the community that everyone is poor, that everyone is uneducated, that everyone is violent, because those kinds of isms, they will keep you from really getting at the truth. And my closing statement is, and it comes from the voices of the people that are with the bridge, it is no longer acceptable to blindly allow outside agencies to have unlimited access to the inner workings of our communities. Don't assume you know who we are. Don't assume that you know how we operate. It will take time for you to get to know us, because we don't trust you, we don't know you, and you don't know us. However, if we can learn to walk together, we can all do some good in our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Elena.
I would add to that is that you walk in an honorable way, you walk in a way that says that we work together. There's a word called matakuyase, which says we are all related, we're all relatives. And I think that's one of the key components is you walk on our land and we allow you to hear our stories and you don't treat those stories as sacred, then there is a way of dishonoring how we all walk and make this journey together. So it really is that transparency, it's learning, it's understanding what the community really need, and that only takes our experts. When people talk about education, they immediately go to schools, college, universities, instead of the fact that I have a grandma who's 89 and who has lived life to the fullest and has more education in her little pinky than I will ever have as I walk through life. So really understanding how that is. And then taking on the big journals is a component that is necessary. I know when they said that when they were going to do and release from the journal, they said, yeah, but it's going to cost your community $130 or $250 to access the report about them. And it's like, no, then we won't do it. And they go, what? You mean you're not going to let us have that because we won't give you access? And it's like, yep. I don't think they heard no for a very long time. And then we're an important journal, but we said no, unless you give us access. And they actually did. They gave us free access for like almost 8 months so that anybody in our community could do that. But we had to ask. They weren't going to give it to us for free. We had to ask. And so I think those are all part of the lessons too for everyone, is asking for things that nobody has ever given and keep on asking, and walking in an honorable way in all communities.
Indeed. Thank you, Elena. Lekesha.
I don't know how to follow up what Dr. May said, because that was, to me, summed up everything that I've ever thought and felt about the way it should work. I think, in summation, what I would say is that what I already said was that, I think that when we come into communities that are not our own, we need to come in and understand that those communities are the experts, and we are coming to learn from them. And hopefully we're coming to leave and give more than we're coming to take. So although we're taking the information, we want to also leave. So I am baffled by the fact that people expect communities to pay for the information that you collect there. However, they're not going to pay for it. I would not, because you know what? It's my lived experience. I live here, so I don't need what you gained. I do also have we did like a data walk where we went through in my local community and there collected health disparity information. And then they had a convening, and it was like a 2 or 3 year process of collecting that data. And then they called some community members and stakeholders back to share that information with them. And what I found was there were the same 3 nonprofits represented in the room, the same 2 or 3 local politicians, and but I did not find that the community was present, right? And I think that if I could leave with anything, it would be if the community is leading, they know who the other members of the community are. At some point, when you're only including the same 2 or 3 Black and brown faces, and there are 2 or 3 organizations, and you are leaving out, you're missing a whole segment, right? Because there are communities within communities. And you would know that if you're not connected to the people that actually live there. So that would be one of the things. I think that is, again, I'll just stick with the fact that things should be community-led, and the rest of us should just walk alongside that community. I'm not a member of the Latino Hispanic community. And so when I come in and I do work with them, I want you to tell me what you need. What am I looking for? This is what I know these stats say, right? But what do you think the problem is? Because the problem on paper might not be the problem that you're truly experiencing. And I have learned so much by just asking what the problem is and not telling you what I've read or what I think it is. Especially doing work with hunger, right? I work with people that are just like, food insecurity, and we got to have, access to healthy foods. And I think, well, having a Whole Foods in that neighborhood is not going to make people, it's not going to help the health disparities that you think it's going to, because they're not going to shop at Whole Foods. They can't afford Whole Foods. And so again, it's the lack of understanding oftentimes from the people that are actually doing the work. So I think that having these conversations is the first step to moving forward and changing the narrative. So thank you guys for having me.
Thank you, Lekesha. And Rebecca, Peter, Jen, I don't want to have to position you to try and close out and top those statements in any way. So I'll leave it up to you if you three might have one collective statement or a thought that you'd want to share as we look to close out the time.
I just want to say thank you for having us. And I dropped a link in the chat to a set of guidelines that came out of this research and a process we did with the Drug Policy Alliance on how to actually form sustainable and ethical relationships between communities and researchers. And thank you again.
Well, thank you all. This has been really, really impactful and insightful. I'd like to turn back to Emily to close us out.
All right. Excuse me. Thank you, Ron, and all of our panelists. This has been a really, really wonderful discussion. We are a couple minutes over time, so I do apologize, but that was just a really wonderful discussion. So if I could just have another couple minutes, please do complete the poll that is on your screen now. We would really love to learn more about who our audience members are and how you felt about this session as we move forward with planning a future speaker series. And again, this event was sponsored by the Community Engagement Alliance Consultative Resource. This is a new-ish program funded by NIH. It's a partnership between University of Pittsburgh and CCPH, Community Campus Partnerships for Health. And our goal is to uplift best practices and innovations in inclusive participation in research by convening tailored expert panels to support equitable community engaged research, to uplift assets, tools, and resources from the CEACR Alliance, and to integrate principles of trustworthiness and research reciprocity into our research ecosystem. So next slide, please. Great, thank you once again. So I do encourage you all to visit the CEACR website where you can submit a request to have an expert consultation if you are a researcher or a CBO rep who is working on a research project. We would love to help support your community engagement efforts. And please mark your calendar for our future speaker series in 2023. And let me just put our little CEACR link in the chat here. And also thank you to everyone who shared resources in the chat. Please make sure to take a look at those. All right, and with that, we will close out. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. That was a really, really fantastic conversation. I feel like we could have gone on for another hour.
Indeed, indeed. Really appreciate you all taking the time to share your thoughts. And I think a lot of what you said rings true in terms of the research we do when it comes to how institutions perpetuate racial oppression. I think one of the comments that noted the traditions that we have with regards to an emphasis on journals, where we know that is just not remotely accessible to the community, and yet we keep emphasizing that as the sort of primary academic product, again, seems to run counter to the mission of institutions that want to service knowledge for social change. So appreciate you bringing that to light.
You know, I work a lot in Eswatini, in the Kingdom of Eswatini, which has the highest HIV prevalence in the world and is also like just a really beautiful place and a nice place to live. And so there's a lot of research conducted there, but the National University can't afford journal subscriptions. So there's a massive amount of research that's generated about Eswatini, none of which can be accessed by researchers in the country, which is just wild to me.
Unbelievable. But again, it's important that we bring this to light so that folks become more aware of how their own practices seem to work against their values. Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Everyone.